The dawn of early May 2024 in Oak Creek, a peaceful rural town in Liberty County, Georgia, should have begun with the crowing of roosters and the fresh morning mist. But the dawn that day began with a blood-curdling scream that tore through the tranquility of the small community. A farmer, while checking on his fields, had discovered a horrific sight. In the basin of a dry irrigation ditch lay the body of a young woman in a thin nightgown, face down in the damp, muddy earth. The Oak Creek Police and the Liberty County Sheriff's Department were on the scene moments later, quickly cordoning off the area. News of a murder spread like wildfire, drawing hundreds of curious residents who gathered to whisper and speculate. The victim was quickly identified. She was Sarah Jenkins, 30 years old, a woman known throughout the town not only for her beauty but also for her gentle and virtuous character. Sarah was married and lived with her husband and brother-in-law in a well-kept house not far from a scene. The brutality of the crime, combined with the fact that the victim was so well loved, sent a shockwave of grief and outrage through the local community. Recognizing the extreme severity of the case, the Liberty County Sheriff's Department reported it and transferred the entire file to the state's top criminal investigators. A special task force was established that same day. The man put in charge of the investigation was Detective Lieutenant Mark Bishop of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation GBI, an investigator famous for his sharp thinking and an intuition that was almost never wrong when it came to cracking the most complex cases. At the scene, Lieutenant Bishop and the forensic examiners worked meticulously. Sarah's body was in an unnatural position, her clothes disheveled, and deep, dark bruises marked her neck. The preliminary on-site examination determined the cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation. In other words, she had been strangled to death. There were numerous scratches on her body, especially on her forearms and knees, indicating that a fierce struggle had taken place before she was killed. But one detail caught Lieutenant Bishop's attention the most. Around her neck, on her hands, and on her ears, all of her gold jewelry and necklace, a pair of earrings, and a bracelet of considerable value was still intact. There was no sign that it had been ripped off or stolen. This almost completely eliminated the theory of a robbery homicide. The killer had not acted for money. He had acted for another motive, something more personal, perhaps revenge, jealousy, or a romantic conflict. Leaving the scene, Lieutenant Bishop and a team of detectives went straight to the victim's home. The two-story house, situated next to the family's small carpentry workshop, was shrouded in a heavy air of grief. The husband, Daniel Jenkins, sat stunned in the living room, his face gaunt, his eyes vacant. He seemed to have completely collapsed from the shock of his wife's death, unable to form a complete sentence, only repeating his wife's name in anguish. In contrast to his older brother, the younger brother, Caleb Jenkins, 28, who also lived in the house, was surprisingly calm. He was the one handling everything, from speaking with relatives to answering the initial questions from the police. Caleb was tall and well-built, with a chiseled face and a very determined gaze. When Lieutenant Bishop asked about Sarah's schedule the previous evening, both brothers gave a unified account. Caleb was the main speaker, articulate and clear, while Daniel just sat beside him, nodding in confirmation between sobs. Caleb explained that around 8 p.m. the night before, after dinner, Sarah had said she was going to her best friend Laura's house to hang out and might even spend the night, as the two had a lot to talk about. This happened occasionally, so neither of them suspected anything. Caleb continued in a lowered voice, explaining that when they did not see her for breakfast that morning, they had started to worry. His brother had called her phone, but it was turned off. They had thought maybe something urgent had come up, so they did not report it right away. He added that they never imagined something like this could happen. The story seemed plausible. The brothers' testimonies matched perfectly. But Lieutenant Bishop, with his years of experience, sensed something was off. He noticed that although Daniel was the one who was devastated, he hardly said a word on his own. Whenever he was asked a question, he would glance at his younger brother as if seeking confirmation before nodding. As for Caleb, his composure in this situation was excessive. He did not seem like a brother grieving the loss of a dear sister-in-law, but rather like a spokesman trying to control the situation and steer the narrative according to a pre-arranged script. Leaving the grieving home, Lieutenant Bishop's mind was already filled with suspicion. He immediately dispatched 2 teams of detectives. The first was to build a complete profile of the victim, Sarah Jenkins, and her social relationships. The second, and most crucial team at this moment, was to immediately meet with the key witness, Laura, the best friend who, according to the brothers, was the last person to see Sarah alive. The results from the first team came back quickly. Everyone they interviewed, from neighbors to old colleagues, had only the kindest words for Sarah. They describe her as a virtuous, gentle woman, completely devoted to her husband and family. Her life was simple, and she had no known conflicts or enemies. She was also an incredibly faithful wife, with no extramarital relationships whatsoever. The purer the victim's portrait became, the more mysterious the killer's motive seemed. But the biggest shock, the first turning point of the case, came from the second team. When investigators found Laura, the victim's best friend, they received an answer that stunned them all. Laura, upon hearing the news of her friend's murder, had cried until she fainted. When the investigators asked if Sarah had come to her house to visit and spend the night, she shook her head emphatically. Through her tears, she said no, she had not. She stated that she had been home alone last night and had no plans with Sarah. The last time she spoke to her was the afternoon 2 days prior. Sarah had even told her she was planning to cook a nice meal for her husband and son that evening. She insisted there was no way Sarah would have come to her house and asked who had told them that, believing there must be some mistake. Laura's statement was like a lightning bolt to the investigation. It proved one undeniable fact: the story that Daniel and Caleb Jenkins told the police was a lie. A lie they had both agreed upon to conceal the victim's true whereabouts on the night she was murdered. Why did they have to lie? What were they trying to hide? For Lieutenant Bishop, an initial vague suspicion had now become an almost certain conviction. The secret to this case was not far away, it was right inside their house, within the complex relationship of the three people who lived under one roof. The killer was very likely one of the two men who had just been playing the part of grieving family members. In the task force command room, Lieutenant Mark Bishop stood before a whiteboard. He took a marker and crossed out the line that said to verify external relationships. In its place, he wrote a new line in large, clear letters: Focus investigation on Daniel and Caleb Jenkins. He told his team, his voice firm, that they had confirmed the two brothers were lying. A coordinated lie between two people immediately after murder, he explained, could only serve one purpose: to cover up the crime. He directed that from that moment on, all investigative activities would revolve around the two subjects. He did not just want them investigated, he wanted every relationship within that family dissected. He ordered his team to turn over every stone, shine a light in every dark corner, and find the real conflict that led to the victim's death. New investigative teams were immediately deployed. One team continued to build a profile of the victim, but this time they dug deeper into her married life and her private thoughts. Detectives sought out more friends and former colleagues from the local textile mill where she had worked before quitting to help her husband. And all of them, without exception, painted a consistent picture. Sarah was a family woman, living an almost reclusive life. Her relationships were centered around her husband, her child, and a few close friends. A former colleague recalled that Sarah was so sweet and would just smile at whatever anyone said. She loved her husband and doted on her son. Ever since she got married, she had pretty much cut off all outside contact, dedicating herself completely to her husband's family carpentry workshop. The colleague mentioned that a few times they had asked her to go out for coffee, but she always refused, saying she had to get home early to cook. She wondered how a woman like that could have an affair or an enemy. These statements made the killer's motive even more incomprehensible but helped the task force completely rule out external suspects. The evil had undoubtedly sprouted from the very ground that Sarah had so diligently nurtured. Meanwhile, another team of detectives was assigned to learn more about the two brothers. They did not approach them directly but skillfully gathered information through friends, business partners, and neighbors to get the most objective view. Regarding the husband, Daniel Jenkins, all the information gathered matched Lieutenant Bishop's initial assessment. He was described as a kind, even weak-willed man. He was a skilled carpenter but lacked the management skills to run a business. The family workshop, inherited from his father, had been struggling under his management. Everyone said he loved his wife very much but often allowed her to be disadvantaged in family matters. A business acquaintance said that Daniel was a good guy, but too soft. He was kind-hearted but had no backbone. It seemed his younger brother made all the major decisions in that house, from business to family. And when the detectives started digging into the younger brother, Caleb Jenkins, a complex and contradictory portrait began to emerge. Caleb did not follow the family trade. After getting a business degree, He worked elsewhere for a few years before returning home. Completely different from his older brother, Caleb was described as an incredibly strong-willed, capable man with a sharp business mind. It was Caleb who had revived the struggling workshop, expanded its scale, and found new clients. In the eyes of many, Caleb was the true pillar, the real master of the Jenkins family. But alongside the admiration for his talent, people also held a certain fear of Caleb. Neighbors said he was very hot-tempered and domineering. They often heard Caleb shouting loudly in the house. Sometimes, he would even scold his older brother like a child. An elderly neighbor said that Caleb was brilliant but completely overshadowed his brother. The neighbor sometimes felt sorry for Daniel, noting that Daniel and his wife could be talking, and as soon as Caleb came home and cleared his throat, Daniel would just shut up. It was like the younger brother was the father. The contrast in the personalities and roles of the two brothers revealed an abnormal power structure. The older brother was the head of the family in name only, while the younger brother held the real power. This led Lieutenant Bishop to a major question. In orchestrating the lie, who was the mastermind? Could a weak-willed man like Daniel have the nerve to invent such a story? Or was he merely a puppet, his strings being pulled by someone more ruthless? The investigation's suspicion increasingly focused on Caleb Jenkins. They felt that behind this young man's calm exterior lay a much deeper secret. And then, when detectives spoke with a distant relative of the family, a crucial detail, a seemingly harmless rumor, was revealed. The relative recounted that during family gatherings, she had noticed something very strange. The woman whispered that the way Caleb looked at his sister-in-law was not a normal look. It was not how a brother-in-law should look at his sister-in-law. It was the look of a man looking at a woman he craved. She described the look as both infatuated and possessive, and frightening. She had seen him look at her like that many times. And every time, Sarah would get uncomfortable and have to find a way to move away. This testimony was like a spark that ignited a completely new and daring investigative theory in Lieutenant Bishop's mind. If this rumor was true, everything would start to make sense. The motive for the murder might not be hatred, but love, a one-sided, incestuous, and sick obsession. A desire that, when unreciprocated, led to a desire to possess. And when possession was impossible, it turned into a destructive rage. The theory was there, but getting from theory to proof was a long road. Lieutenant Bishop knew that to prove this, he needed scientific evidence. He was waiting for the final forensic report from the crime lab. He believed that the victim herself, in the final moments of her life, had left behind the trace of her killer. As the investigation deepened, the portrait of the Jenkins family became more distorted. The theory of Caleb Jenkins's one-sided obsession was gaining ground, but it was still just a theory. Lieutenant Bishop and his team knew that to charge someone as intelligent as Caleb, rumors were not enough. They needed physical evidence. And while the task force focused on human intelligence, in the state crime lab, experts were quietly at work, seeking the truth from the victim's body itself. They knew that the dead sometimes tell more honest stories than the living. In the second week of the investigation, the full forensic report was finally completed and sent to Lieutenant Bishop. He read it carefully. Most of the findings confirmed the initial assessments. The victim died of asphyxiation from strangulation. The time of death was between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. Her stomach was nearly empty. But the most important detail was on the final page, in a section on microscopic and DNA analysis. The examiners had discovered something critically important. While examining the samples collected from the body, they noticed that the fingernails on the victim's right hand were broken. This proved that in the final moments of her life, Sarah had not given up. She had fought back fiercely, using her own fingernails as a final weapon to claw at her attacker. Immediately, the examiners carefully clipped all 10 of the victim's fingernails and put them under microscope. Trapped deep beneath the nails, especially the index and middle fingers of the right hand, were tiny fragments of skin tissue and a few traces of dried blood. An extraordinary effort by the DNA lab team was launched. From those minuscule samples, they worked tirelessly and succeeded. They managed to extract and replicate a complete DNA profile. That profile did not belong to the victim. It belonged to the person who had murdered her. In her life and death struggle, the victim herself had preserved the evidence that would expose her killer. Holding the report, Lieutenant Bishop felt a current run down his spine. This was it. This was the ultimate weapon he needed. They now had the genetic profile of the murderer. All that was left was to find the person who matched it. And he knew the answer was almost certainly within the victim's own home. The case could now be solved quickly by summoning the brothers and requesting a DNA sample. But Lieutenant Bishop did not do that. He knew that with only DNA evidence, a cunning person like Caleb might invent another story to deny his guilt. He wanted a decisive blow, a combined assault of scientific and psychological evidence that would make the killer completely collapse. He decided to temporarily keep the DNA results a secret. Instead, he directed his high-tech crime unit to expedite breaking into Sarah's cell phone. He believed that in that private world, Sarah must have also left traces of her fear. And his intuition, once again, was correct. While the DNA report was temporarily sealed, the high-tech crime unit was racing against time. Sarah Jenkins's cell phone was a black box containing the final secrets of her life. But that black box was protected by a complex password. The best experts were mobilized, working around the clock. Time ticked by tensely. Lieutenant Bishop knew he could not keep the DNA results a secret for long. He needed more psychological evidence, something that could completely break the killer's resolve. And then, after 3 sleepless days and nights, a cheer erupted from the tech room. They had succeeded. The screen of Sarah's phone lit up. The investigators began a digital excavation. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Her texts were mostly with her husband about family matters or chats with friends. There was no sign of a hidden relationship or a conflict. But when a young investigator opened the Notes app, he found something unusual. Alongside the normal notes about recipes and shopping lists, there was a single file named as a diary. And that file was locked with a second layer of security. Once again, the tech experts went to work. Based on Sarah's personal information, they tried a few combinations and the password opened. It was the birth date of the son she adored. The contents were diary entries, secret thoughts filled with pain and fear that Sarah had written over the last 6 months of her life. As the investigators read them, they were stunned. It revealed a horrifying secret, a living hell this virtuous woman had been silently enduring. The first entries, from about 6 months ago, were just vague feelings of unease. Sarah had written that she was always feeling anxious, noting that the way her brother-in-law Caleb looked at her had become stranger. It was not a respectful look anymore, but something so intense it gave her goosebumps. She wondered if she was overthinking it. That anxiety became clearer in the following entries. Sarah wrote about her brother-in-law's suspiciously accidental actions. She described an incident where Caleb walked by and accidentally bumped into her while she was cleaning. She noted it would not be a big deal if it did not happen so often, and that his hand had deliberately touched her in sensitive places. When she jumped back, he had just smiled and said it was an accident, but she knew he had done it on purpose. She agonized over what to do, believing her husband would not believe her and that telling him would just cause more trouble. Sarah's fear grew day by day. She began to feel suffocated, hunted in her own home. Caleb's suggestive comments and his compliments on her appearance became more blatant. And then, the final diary entry, written just 3 days before she was murdered, recorded a horrifying event, a confession and a threat. She wrote that she could not sleep because the most terrible thing had happened. Caleb had cornered her on the stairs when they were alone and confessed that he loved her. He had been secretly in love with her since the first day she married into the family. He claimed her husband was a weak man who did not deserve her and that only he could make her happy. She was shocked and disgusted. She firmly rejected him and told him that if he did not stop, she would tell his brother everything. At that, his expression changed completely. The look of love vanished, replaced by a furious rage. He grabbed her arm tightly, leaned close, and said something she would probably never forget, that she would regret rejecting him. The diary entry ended there, with a shaky, panicked stroke of the pen. After reading these words, the entire investigation room fell silent. A wave of outrage and pity washed over everyone. They understood everything. The motive for the murder was not just love, it was hatred. The madness of a man with a sick obsession who had been rejected. Caleb Jenkins did not just kill his sister-in-law because he was afraid of being exposed. He killed her as an act of revenge. Detective Lieutenant Mark Bishop sat there, holding the printouts of the diary pages. Beside him lay the DNA report. On one side was the psychological evidence, recording the victim's pain. On the other was the scientific evidence, preserving the killer's physical trace. Both pieces of evidence pointed to a single name. He stood up. His face was like ice, but a fire burned in his eyes. He knew the endgame had arrived. This time, he would not give that monster a single chance to deny his guilt. The second summons was issued urgently. This time, it was not an invitation to talk, it was an official warrant. Both brothers, Daniel and Caleb Jenkins, were brought to the sheriff's headquarters in separate vehicles and placed in different interrogation rooms. Lieutenant Bishop decided to confront the weaker link first, the husband, Daniel Jenkins. In the interrogation room, Daniel was extremely panicked. Bishop did not ask about the night of the murder. He simply placed the printouts of Sarah's diary on the table and told him to read it. Daniel's hands trembled as he picked up the pages. As he read the first few lines, his face began to change color. The more he read, the more violently his body shook. He read about his wife's fear, about the sick harassment from the very brother he had always trusted. And when he reached the last page, the disgusting confession and cruel threat, Daniel could no longer hold back. He dropped his head to the table and broke down, sobbing like a child. He choked out in agony that he had not known and questioned why she had hidden something so horrible from him. Daniel's collapse confirmed the diary's authenticity. The first wall of silence had been broken. Lieutenant Bishop, his voice sharpening, asked why he had lied to them and why he and his brother had invented the story about Sarah going to her friend's house. His grief turning to rage, Daniel screamed that it was Caleb. That morning, when he could not find his wife, Caleb was the one who told him she had left. He had said she was not worthy of him and that he should not make a scene. He had told him what to say if anyone asked. Daniel confessed he was so weak that he had believed him, never thinking his brother was a devil in disguise. Daniel's confession, though only about the cover-up, gave the task force a massive psychological advantage before the final showdown. Caleb Jenkins was led into the interrogation room. Unlike his brother, he maintained a cold, calm expression, even a hint of defiance. He believed that as long as he did not confess, no one could touch him. Lieutenant Bishop got straight to the point, stating that they knew everything. They knew about his sick feelings for his sister-in-law and the threats he made after she rejected him. Caleb just smirked, saying he did not know what the lieutenant was talking about and that they must have been listening to baseless rumors. He denied everything smoothly, but he did not know that was just the first psychological blow. Lieutenant Bishop gave a signal. The door opened, and Daniel, his eyes red and swollen, was led in to stand face to face with his brother. The direct confrontation made Caleb slightly flustered. And then, Lieutenant Bishop played his final ace, the decisive blow. His voice as cold as ice, he told Caleb that he could deny it, but science did not lie. He revealed that during the struggle, Sarah had clawed at him and they had found his DNA under her fingernails. He informed Caleb they would be taking a sample of his DNA for comparison and asked if he had anything else to say. Hearing the two letters DNA and the irrefutable scientific evidence, the color drained from Caleb Jenkins's face. The calmness, the confidence, the defiance, it all vanished in an instant. His eyes widened, staring at Lieutenant Bishop as if he could not believe what he was hearing. He had planned everything, but he had never imagined that the victim herself would leave behind irrefutable evidence. He knew it was over. The final wall of defense had completely crumbled. Caleb slowly lowered his head. His broad shoulders began to tremble. And then, he dropped his face to the table, accepting the brutal truth. He finally confessed that he had killed her. The entire interrogation room seemed to freeze after Caleb's confession. The mention of DNA evidence had completely demolished his final wall of defense. The silence stretched for nearly a minute, a thick, heavy silence more damning than 1,000 questions. Caleb did not look up, he just sat there, motionless, but his entire world was collapsing. He knew he had lost. Finally, a long, weary sigh escaped his chest. His broad shoulders slumped. He slowly raised his face, now devoid of all its former arrogance, and looked directly at Lieutenant Bishop. His voice was hoarse as he stated that it was all him. The first words of confession had been spoken, and once the floodgates of guilt were opened, the dark torrent of truth began to pour out. Caleb no longer tried to evade. He recounted his entire crime, a story of sick infatuation, jealousy, and a rage that destroyed everything. He confessed that he had been secretly in love with his sister-in-law, Sarah, from the first day she married into the family. To Caleb, Sarah was the perfect woman. Meanwhile, his brother, Daniel, was a weak-willed man with no ambition. He always felt it was unfair that his brother did not deserve such a wonderful wife. Caleb said with bitterness that he was the one who had saved the workshop and handled everything in the house. He should have been the one worthy of her, not his brother. That infatuation gradually turned into an obsession. He began trying to get closer to his sister-in-law with seemingly accidental touches. But Sarah, with her woman's intuition, recognized it and always found ways to avoid him. Her avoidance only made Caleb's desire more intense. He could not take it anymore. 3 days before the murder, he cornered Sarah and confessed everything, begging her to leave his brother for him. Caleb gritted his teeth, hatred flashing in his eyes as he remembered her refusal. She had looked at him with disgust and called him a sick, incestuous pervert. She had threatened to tell his brother everything and make it so he could never show his face in the family again. That rejection and threat were a fatal blow to Caleb's ego. His sick love quickly turned into a frenzied hatred. He was not just afraid of being exposed, he could not accept being humiliated by the woman he worshipped. A cruel plan of revenge was born. If he could not have her, no one could. On the night of the murder, knowing Sarah had a habit of taking a walk in the fields, Caleb waited for her. He confronted her one last time, begging her to reconsider. But Sarah was resolute. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, as he saw Sarah turn her back to walk away, he lunged at her from behind. Caleb said, his voice trembling, that he did not clearly remember what he did. He just remembered being so angry. He used his hands and squeezed her neck. She struggled and scratched his hands hard. But at that moment, he was like an animal. He just squeezed until she went limp and collapsed at his feet. After the murder, the rage subsided, replaced by overwhelming fear. Panicked, he looked at the lifeless body of his sister-in-law. His only thought was to hide the crime. He dragged her body to the nearby dry ditch, threw her in, and rushed home. Back at the house, he used his intelligence to manipulate his weak-willed brother. He invented the story about Sarah having plans to sleep at a friend's house. The next morning, he calmed his brother down and created the alibi of her running away. Daniel, with his trusting nature, followed the script without a single doubt. The confession ended. A chilling silence filled the interrogation room. The story of a family tragedy had been fully reconstructed. It did not stem from hatred or money, but from a one-sided love that had mutated into a monster. Caleb's confession closed the investigative chapter of the case. A few days later, the final DNA report came back, confirming what they already knew. The skin and blood samples under the victim's fingernails were a perfect match to Caleb Jenkins. The scientific evidence put an irrefutable end to his crime. The case of the brother-in-law who murdered his sister-in-law out of obsession sent a massive shockwave through the once peaceful rural community. The trial, held at the Liberty County Superior Court, drew widespread public attention. The large courtroom was packed with family from both sides, as well as curious residents. In the defendant's box, the two brothers, Daniel and Caleb, stood side by side, but an unbridgeable chasm now separated them. Daniel was a wreck, his eyes constantly filled with tears. As for Caleb, the murderer, after his initial breakdown, now appeared terrifyingly calm. He stood there silently, his face expressionless. The district attorney's indictment was read, each word like a knife. The entire plot from the sick love and harassment to the brutal murder and cover-up was laid bare. Excerpts from Sarah's fearful diary were read aloud, causing waves of sorrow and indignation. During questioning, Daniel, between sobs, admitted to his crime of making a false report, stating that he had acted under the manipulation of his younger brother. He expressed extreme remorse for being too weak to save his wife. When it was Caleb's turn, he answered defiantly. He admitted to the facts of the crime as he had confessed, but without a single word of apology or hint of remorse. He blamed his love and the victim's rejection for pushing him down this path. His inhuman attitude disgusted everyone present. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, and the judge delivered the final sentence. The presiding judge, in a steely voice, declared that Caleb Jenkins's actions were exceptionally barbaric, trampling on all moral values and the sanctity of family. The defendant's crimes showed he was beyond rehabilitation and needed to be permanently removed from society. On the charge of murder, with special circumstances of premeditation and cruelty, the court sentenced the defendant, Caleb Jenkins, to death. On the charge of making a false statement to law enforcement, the defendant, Daniel Jenkins, was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with the sentence suspended. The judge noted his minor role and sincere remorse as factors in the lenient sentence. The verdict was read in silence. Caleb stood there without emotion. Only Daniel collapsed to the floor, crying out in pain and shame. The case was closed, but the tragedy of the Jenkins family would last forever. Sarah's parents had lost their gentle daughter. The parents of Daniel and Caleb had lost even more: a daughter-in-law, one son sentenced to death, and another who would live the rest of his life tormented by guilt. The carpentry workshop, the foundation of their family, was left in ruins. The story of Caleb's incestuous obsession became a terrifying lesson on the fragile line between love and crime. But above all, the case was a testament to the persistence of justice and the power of forensic science. And it was a silent tribute to the victim. Though she died a tragic death, Sarah Jenkins, in the final moments of her life, through her instinctual act of fighting back, left behind the most crucial piece of evidence, herself, an indelible accusation that brought her own killer to light.